Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. It's 1 o'clock, so let's get started. Welcome to the Nature Conservancy's webinar, Paradise, Parking Lot, or Both. My name is Liz Fly. I'm the Marine Conservation Director with the South Carolina chapter of the Nature Conservancy, and we're really thrilled to have you all joining us this afternoon. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes to help with your viewing experience. For the best viewing experience, we recommend you click speaker view. You'll find this in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And also, we would love to hear from you, and we have time for questions at the end of the presentation. So please, throughout the presentation, feel free to chat questions into the chat box. You'll find that, I think, at the lower portion of your screen. Everyone is on mute, so please type your questions into that chat box. And lastly, we will have some polls sprinkled throughout the webinar to keep you engaged. So be on the lookout for those, and we hope that you'll participate. And actually, we'll launch our first poll right now to get to know you, the audience, a little bit better before we jump into our presentation. So this first poll is asking, where are you joining us from today? Okay, well, the Low Country wins. We've got a little bit more than half of you joining from the Low Country, but I do see folks from other parts of the state as well as out of state. So welcome, and thanks again for joining in. Well, we are really pleased today to that Greenville Water is our presenting sponsor for today's webinar. And the Nature Conservancy South Carolina has a 28-year history with Greenville Water that began in 1993 when Greenville Water proactively entered into a conservation easement with TNC to protect about 30,000 acres of land surrounding the Table Rock and North Saluda reservoirs. This protected both of these drinking water sources from development in perpetuity. Greenville Water is our state's largest utility company, and they're the recipient of several awards recognizing their great tasting drinking water and their commitment to sustainability. So joining us today is Emerald Clark, Greenville Water's Public Relations Manager, to make a few remarks. Emerald?
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and welcome everyone. We are proud to partner with TNC to support the nature-based solutions that work not only for people, but for nature. It's truly one of the reasons that we're thrilled to work with TNC to restore the forests in our watershed using prescribed fire. And what's even more exciting is one of the projects that you're going to learn about today, which is the upgrades and improvements to TNC's Blue Wall Preserve, which is a special piece of property adjacent to the Landrum watershed, and that serves as a buffer to our Greenville Water North Saluda Reservoir. Our team at Greenville Water is grateful for all of the TNC members here in our state and nationwide, and we thank all of our customers that invest in TNC's work every year. We're truly proud to partner with TNC and look forward to how we can share more throughout our state with everyone. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Emerald, and we're really thrilled to have you all as a sponsor today, so thank you. And for those of you not as familiar with the Nature Conservancy, we're a leading conservation organization working in all 50 states and in more than 70 countries worldwide to protect important lands and waters for nature and for people. TNC has been a part of the South Carolina conservation tradition for more than 50 years. Our first project was in 1969, establishing the Beidler Forest Sanctuary. Since then, TNC has protected nearly 400,000 acres across the state. And in addition to land protection, the South Carolina chapter has programs in freshwater conservation, forest restoration, coastal resilience, and healthy oceans. And now, without further ado, I am pleased to introduce my co-conspirator for today's webinar, Joshua Robinson. Joshua is a licensed professional engineer with 17 years experience in analysis, planning, design, and implementation of water resource management and green infrastructure design projects across the Southeast. In 2008, he founded Robinson Design Engineers in an effort to provide ecologically based engineering analyses and design for low-impact development projects and to integrate aquatic ecosystem management into urban and rural communities. Joshua currently leads this great team of water resource engineers and scientists you see pictured on the screen here. And in his spare time, he also serves as adjunct faculty at the College of Charleston. And Joshua has been a really great partner with TNC throughout the years, and it certainly felt fitting to introduce him and put up this quote from Wendell Berry on your screen. "We cannot know what we are doing until we know what nature would be doing if we were doing nothing." And in a world where it feels like at times it's hard to break free from traditional gray, hard infrastructure like dams and seawalls and concrete ditches, it's great to work with someone like Joshua who really gets it, who really gets nature and really understands the benefits that nature can provide to people. And that's really the purpose of our webinar today, to showcase some of the work across the state where we're giving nature a little jump start to then let it do its thing, to heal, to flourish, and then provide multiple benefits. And Joshua, so I personally tend to use the term nature-based solutions, but our audience may have heard many terms for that: green infrastructural, natural infrastructure, nature, natural defenses. There's a whole slew of terms. So how do you define these phrases, and what do you generally see as the benefits of choosing green over gray?
Yeah, thank you, Liz, and thank you for that great introduction. When I think about green infrastructure, the thing that I think most about is the green represents the use of plant materials, because especially in the Southeast and across South Carolina, our whole landscape is just covered in vegetation. So that's what, to my mind, that's the green and green infrastructure. And then in terms of nature-based solutions, this quote by Wendell Berry has been a guiding principle to us in our work through the years. And it sort of represents this idea that oftentimes as engineers or even, folks in the land use management practices, we are finding ourselves working in opposition to natural processes. But this quote, we cannot know what we are doing until we know what nature would be doing if we were doing nothing. It helps us to keep in mind that nature has this sort of inherent wisdom, and natural ecosystems, and today we'll be talking about aquatic ecosystems. The science tells us that these aquatic ecosystems are always working to heal themselves. So nature-based solutions are they inspire us to really study and understand what the natural ecosystems are trying to do on their own, so we can help jumpstart them or give them a nudge in the right direction, and then just sort of stand back and let them, heal themselves.
Absolutely. And I know that, in South Carolina, we have this kind of great study system for all this. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so this is just a textbook diagram that we use to think about the different parts of a landscape in terms of a river basin. And it's really helpful to contextualize the projects we're going to talk about today, because South Carolina, even to be such a small state, it has such a diverse array of aquatic ecosystems. And we have so many different types, from the mountains up in the upstate, which we'll talk about, all the way to the Piedmont and foothills, and then down into the Sandhills region. You see here the Zone 2 transfer zone, and then finally down in the coastal zone where we have, salt marshes and tidal creeks and river estuaries. So today, we're going to talk about all three of these different zones and how they each contribute to the overall sort of watershed or aquatic ecosystem environment of our state.
That's right. And so we're giving you a little preview here on this map of some of the projects that we'll talk about today. Some of these are Nature Conservancy projects. Some of these are Robinson Design Engineer projects, and a couple of them are collaborations between the two of us, our two organizations. So we are excited to share these with you. So without further ado, let's jump into the first project, which is Blue Wall. And so as Emerald mentioned, we have Blue Wall Preserve. This is a TNC preserve. It's one of 8 that we own and manage throughout the state. And what makes Blue Wall so special is it's part of this Landrum watershed. So Vaughn's Creek runs through Blue Wall, and it has been rated exceptional water quality by DHEC, and this is the highest rating for clean water. It also stands as a buffer to the much larger Greenville watershed. And additionally, it's used by Furman University students. And so it's just this really special gem that helps educate future scientists and conservationists. And the project that Joshua will be talking about is a proposed man-made dam removal on the preserve. So, but first let's launch our next poll, because all humans are not the only ones that are building dams at this preserve. Let's see how much you know about nature's dam builder, the North American beaver. All right. Okay, so maybe some of you were tripped up by that is not true, but it is not true. They cannot breathe underwater, but they do have high amounts of iron in their tooth enamel, and they are a major creator of trout habitat. So Joshua, do you want to jump in and tell us what's going on at Blue Wall?
Sure. Yeah. So Blue Wall Preserve, as Liz, as you mentioned, is this beautiful gem, and Blue Wall Preserve includes 2 lakes. Now, these lakes are created by dams, earthen dams that were built many decades ago. And one of the first steps we did was to inspect the dams, and we determined that the dams were getting very near the end of their useful life, as we tend to call that in engineering parlance. So that means that the dams either needed to be completely reconstructed or they needed to be considered for removal. Well, at the same time, we noticed that a lot of the aspects of the dam structure, the spillway, had been taken over by a local beaver colony, and they were trying to build, dams out of sticks on top of the dams. So all through the process, we realized that the beavers are trying to build dams here, and these lakes, we really need to either rebuild the dams or consider what's going to happen here next. And you'll notice here in this sort of broad valley within the mountains, this is a very rare wetland habitat type. And you mentioned amphibians or salamanders here. There's some different types of fish that are present in Vaughn Creek. And so you see on the fringe of the lake here, these little wetlands that are trying to grow and encroach onto the lake here. And so over the next couple slides, you'll see that the Blue Wall Preserve Lake, the lakes are, they have a lot of open water habitat, but they actually want to be more true wetland habitat. Here's another image. You can see the fringe marsh or like a grassy wetland trying to move into the open water. And then on the next slide, you'll see that actually the Blue Wall Preserve, we know, wants to be a little bit more like a true sort of upland beaver meadow. Well, it turns out that the Nature Conservancy chapter of Maine has a preserve that features, granted it's much further north, but it's a similar sort of mountain wetland habitat. And the missing ingredient is an active colony of the North American beaver. And so just like the poll question sort of introduced this idea that the North American beaver are the nature's natural aquatic ecosystem engineers. And so what they're always trying to do is dam up the flow of water, but it's not just, they're damming up the flow of water also creates habitat for all sorts of other species. So at the Blue Wall Preserve, what we're currently working on designing and permitting is to remove the dams that are there currently, the man-made dams, and to replace them with beaver dam analogs. So instead of having one big dam, we're working to build a series of smaller dams. And you can see here an example of a beaver dam analog. They've been used out west over the last few decades, but this is the first case we know of in the Southeast, particularly in South Carolina, where a large-scale beaver dam analog has been implemented, where we'll go in and put in wooden posts and then weave in the wooden posts with sticks and brush and try to encourage the beavers to sort of take over this small dam. And so eventually they'll take it over and they'll make it the way they want it to be. And eventually we expect it, based on other studies, we expect it to become a real natural beaver dam complex. And then the aquatic ecosystem will begin to grow. And again, this is an example of we're just sort of getting out of the way and jump starting the natural process so that it can heal itself over time.
That's great. And, this is a really popular place for hiking and recreation. And so it'll be a great opportunity for folks to see this type of natural wetland environment and perhaps some educational opportunities as well. Well, great. Well, thanks for that. Let's move down I-26 and talk about a project that's happening in Columbia, in our state capital. But first, we're going to launch our next poll. Rivers are a big part of life in South Carolina. We draw our drinking water from them. We fish, we boat, we kayak, and many of our largest cities were built near rivers to facilitate trade. So let me know if you know what 3 rivers join together in Columbia. Okay, we're getting a high percentage of correct answers here. Good. Well, 90% of you have got the correct answer. The Broad and the Saluda come together in Columbia to form the Congaree. Good job. And so, of course, just as little capillaries in our bodies connect to arteries and veins, little creeks and streams connect to our bigger rivers, and they provide critical habitat. But what happens, to go with our title, when paradise is paved to put up a parking lot? Joshua, can paradise be unearthed?
Well, that's what we're going to be talking about in this project in Columbia, an urban creek daylighting. So the idea of daylighting a creek, you know, just like you mentioned that there's 3 major rivers in Columbia, several large through the urban core of Columbia. Smith Branch is one of them. Smith Branch have been completely buried around for many decades to make way for urban growth. And as a result, there's been flooding that's happened over time. And so the Bull Street redevelopment project is on the location of the hospital campus, the state hospital campus, and the city of Columbia has partnered with let's see, I can't see the next slide here.
Sorry, a little difficulty. Is it coming through?
So the city of Columbia has partnered with a private development group, Hughes Development, to create it's kind of an expansion of the downtown area into this sort of mixed-use community that's built on this 200-acre area just on the north corner of downtown Columbia. So in the middle of this is one of these segments of Smith Branch that's been buried underground for many decades. So you can see here this 20-acre public park. The idea was originally, this project started about 10 years ago. The idea was let's turn a new public park space, let's create a new public park in the middle of this downtown area, and let's take this creek that's flowed underground for many decades and bring it to the surface so that it can see the light of day for the first time in many years. But then let's keep the pipes that are underground, let's keep those in place as well so that they can convey the floodwaters. So this is a good example of where we keep the gray infrastructure and the green infrastructure that can work together. And here's an image of just the degraded creek system before the project, one of the segments of the channel that was open. And then you'll see here, soon after construction, that open channel, we restored the banks, put in natural riparian vegetation, and used some stone structures to help control the flow of the water. And then a couple of years later, the riparian buffer is growing in, and you can see nice native riparian vegetation growing. And as the park is developed and as the new campus is developed, there'll be nature trails that go along this creek, and it provides a really nice setting for the urban users of downtown. Here's an image of the pipes. These were 8-foot diameter pipes that still exist. These 8-foot diameter pipes as I said before, the creek has been flowing through these 8-foot diameter pipes since at least the 1950s. So we left the pipes in place, but created a new hydraulic structure. And you can see a picture during construction to just get a sense of the scale of these pipes. And these are really important pieces of engineering infrastructure that can convey or let a lot of water flow through there to diminish flooding. But then parallel to these pipes, we built a new natural stream channel. And so the new natural stream channel flows during big storms, overflows into this pipe system. And during small storms, and also during base flow, water flows through this natural small creek that flows through the park. So here's an image of that creek during construction. You can see some new condominiums in the background on the edge of this park. It's sort of like a small central park setting is one of the inspirations. And then now, a couple years later, the new creek has been revegetated. We have this beautiful floodplain meadow, and you can see the lawn areas in the background. So the new residential areas face this beautiful park, and this big floodplain meadow handles a tremendous volume of water and also improves water quality. And again, we have all these co-benefits of just the creek. It conveys floodwater, but it also provides a natural area to recreate, and it provides tremendous habitat for a place where there was really no habitat before.
Such a huge amenity to this area. I love seeing projects like this come to life. And you mentioned the combination of gray and green infrastructure, and that's so true, right? I mean, it's not always that completely green infrastructure is going to solve the problem, or completely gray infrastructure, but when you can find that mix of the two and work together, that is, I think, is a really powerful example of that.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, thanks. I love this. If you get to Columbia, please go check this one out. It's so great. Well, let's move down a little bit further down towards the coast. And course, while streams and rivers give us so much, as the last 6 years has made it painfully clear, they can also be a flooding hazard to nearby homes and businesses. And Conway, South Carolina has been one of those places that's kind of felt like ground zero for a lot of the major flooding happening recently. The October 2015 floods shattered the flood record in Conway, but that was then in turn shattered by Hurricane Matthew the following year. But then that record was shattered by Hurricane Florence 2 years later. So, ground zero, a lot of flooding from both riverine flooding and flash flooding in this area. So you'll see a couple images of this church over here, and I'll settle on this one. This is Trinity United Methodist Church in Conway. You may recognize these types of images from the news. Flooded over and over again, as well as a number of the houses surrounding this area. So the city of Conway went ahead and bought out a number of properties in this area to get people out of harm's way from homes that had flooded repetitively. The city then partnered with us, the Nature Conservancy, and we worked with Joshua and his firm to develop a really out-of-the-box natural project here. This project was funded by Boeing, and it meant to really address the flooding in this area, but in a more natural way around this church. So Joshua, can you describe the project here?
Yeah, if you go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so here's a diagram that kind of explains sort of one of our guiding image of what we were trying to create here in Conway. So as Liz mentioned, there were a number of homes in this community that have been repetitively flooded, and the city was able to get funds from FEMA to buy these houses out. But then what was left was an area that used to be part of a thriving neighborhood was now just sort of open field. And so one of our first steps was to work with the city and with the Nature Conservancy to determine, how could we use these areas to not only reduce flood risk in the future, but also provide ecological benefits, because this was a area that flooded, because it's along a natural water course and there are natural wetlands in the area. So how could we use this to sort of expand the natural wetlands that are there? Again, this idea of kind of getting out of the way of what nature is already trying to do. Clearly, the natural system would like to have this area to flood more often. So we can create ecological benefits, but then how can we use it as a community asset? So that what was once sort of this area that was, there was some sadness about having to lose these several homes. How can we convert this area into something that became a community benefit for the neighborhood, but also for the whole city? So this is sort of the idea behind nature-based solutions to reduce flood impacts, is these three different things working together. And here is just a diagram that we used early in the project. The top image here, you see just a section cut of the Trinity United Methodist Church, and then a scale drawing that shows sort of the open field that was left after the houses were demolished, and then a storm sewer system that flowed through the neighborhood. And then our concept became, what if we were to take these areas that naturally flood, like this bottom image shows, what if we were to take those areas that naturally flood and excavate soil, so that when the areas do flood, they can even flood more and have more room, more capacity to hold that flood water. So then we had another series of diagrams you can see here. What if we were to remove that soil and then create a natural wetland system to basically allow the existing wetland that's nearby to sort of expand into this new wetland, and then build boardwalks and nature viewing areas so that during dry weather or during sunny days, that the community could use this as sort of a nature preserve in a park and actually learn about wetland ecosystems. And then, then we had to think about what happens during a big flood event. So then the idea became, well, we'll be excavating a lot of soil from this area to give it more room to flood. Some of that soil could be used to build natural berms, very small berms, so that during extremely high flood events, like the ones we saw a few years ago, that those berms could help to prevent flooding for the houses and for the community infrastructure that remains, so that, again, this area can reduce flooding, protect the infrastructure that's there, but also create great habitat. And here's a rendering that we put together of what one of the early conceptual ideas. Now, Conway already has a beautiful boardwalk system on the Waccamaw River, so we wanted to draw inspiration from that because that's a very familiar part of Conway. But this would also be an example, a great way to sort of showcase the different unique wetland types that are in and around Conway and the coastal plain of South Carolina. So we expect to have boardwalks and, again, open water habitats and marsh habitats and flowering plants. Here's an image of one of those boardwalks along the Waccamaw River. So this will really feel like home in Conway because this is a characteristic part of the city and the community there. And we have a few slides here of images of wetlands in and around Conway. And we'll talk some about these Carolina bays, but here's images of Carolina bays that have open water habitat with large trees, also some small creek systems and shallow wetlands with things like shrub palmetto, which you saw. Here's an area with, like a cypress tupelo swamp that provides great habitat for waterfowl. These are characteristic types of wetlands that, we're all familiar with in the state of South Carolina. But the really kind of one of the fascinating ideas that emerged was, Conway is right in the center of this cluster of Carolina bays that sort of are up and down the Carolina coast. And if you're not familiar, Carolina bays are these shallow depressions that are oval in shape or sort of egg shaped, and they're all oriented in this special orientation. And there's, probably hundreds of them, if not more, up and down the South Carolina coast. Well, it just turned out that the buyout zone for the Conway project, that buyout area happened to be in the rough shape of an oval. So we thought, this would be a great way, and working with the city of Conway and the Nature Conservancy, we realized that, this would be a great way to showcase Carolina bays and provide sort of an outdoor laboratory so that guests of the park and folks in the city and folks that come through the city would be able to see this wetland park. And although we're not trying to mimic a Carolina bay, but it just happens to be in the shape of one, so it gives us a great opportunity to have sort of an educational laboratory. You'll see these yellow lines here represent the boardwalks and the trails that'll go through the wetland. This is about an 8-acre site with a variety of habitats from open water to shallow wetland systems to forested wetlands. So it'll be just a really good opportunity within the neighborhood, and it'll connect to some existing greenways and walking paths to the downtown area.
And just to orient folks, Joshua, this is the church right here, right? The Trinity United Methodist Church.
That's right.
Okay, so those are the images you saw. Then I can say I know the city of Conway has been a great partner in this project, and they're calling this project Chestnut Bay to play off of the Carolina Bay concept there, and they're very excited to get this in the ground. They've applied for some funding from a federal disaster funding pot of money, or a pre-disaster mitigation pot of money to get this project in the ground. So we're hoping to see that happen soon. This has been a really inspiring project to see. Well, let's keep moving down the coast. We're going to end up on the coast now. And, while these areas like Conway are seeing more and more riverine flooding in the last number of years, our shorelines are, of course, seeing more erosion due to things like stronger storms and rising seas. And one natural solution that we're going to talk about for these issues is living shorelines. But before we dive in, let's launch our next poll that's about an important component of many living shorelines, which is the oyster. So do you know how many gallons of water an adult oyster can filter in one day? Y'all are good. Okay, well, 3/4 of you were correct in that it's 50 gallons of water that one adult oyster can filter in a day. And if you scale that up, so to put it in even more perspective, trying to advance my slide there. A couple of years ago, we built a 50-foot long oyster reef near McClellanville, and we calculated that on average, that reef can filter as much water as the Plum Island sewage treatment plant in Charleston does on an average day. So talk about your natural water filters. The oysters are where it's at. And so, like I said, oysters are not the only component of living shorelines, but they can be a major piece. Joshua, can you give us kind of your definition of a living shoreline and talk about their benefits?
Yeah, sure. Well, when I think about a living shoreline, I think about it as contrasting with the typical shoreline we see in the developed landscape of the coast, which is, a lot of times it's bulkheads and seawalls. But once upon a time, almost all of our shorelines and our tidal creeks and estuaries, were lined by oyster shells and oyster reefs, like you see here in this image. You can even see in the background some oyster, overwash there, where there's like a large berm of oyster shell from many generations ago. And so a living shoreline it's literally alive because of the oyster shell, but also the different marsh grasses that grow in the area. And those things work together to create habitat, but also to keep stable the sediments that compose that shoreline. And, through many years of over harvesting of oysters and also boat wake and different changes in the coastal landscape, in a lot of cases, the oyster shells have been excessively removed, which has made our shorelines open to erosion. And so once these erosional processes start, it's very hard to change them unless there's some sort of hard substrate or something to stop that process. Well, here's an image you can see of just a sort of an experimental living shoreline using some placed oyster shell. And this is a great photo that kind of depicts the power of these living shorelines, where just a small group of clusters of oyster shell are placed. And then just in a couple of seasons time, you can see that new oysters have grown here. And you can also see that sediment has deposited behind the reef, and that the marsh grasses have now been allowed to grow up into places where before they had been eroded away.
Yeah, and you were talking before, Joshua, about how as a engineer, typically it's been kind of seawalls and bulkheads, right? And so this is living shorelines are a growing interest. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, as a consulting engineer who does a lot of permitting, it's easier to design and have permitted and built a bulkhead or just a seawall, even if it's an area that would naturally be sort of a natural shoreline. And so, there's some exciting things I know you'll talk about in a little while, but some exciting, changes that are happening in our state, and a lot of other states are making some of the same changes in the Southeast, where we now have a regulatory path where we can, design and implement living shorelines to stabilize shores where otherwise they might have, if there's erosion of a shore, the only real option, straightforward option, would be putting in a bulkhead of sheet piles or wood or something else that's not a natural solution at all.
That's right. Yeah. So I want to share a couple images. So the Nature Conservancy in South Carolina has installed 11 living shorelines in the past 10 years up and down the coast. And of course, folks like DNR and other groups have also installed a number up and down the coast. And we work together with a number of great partners. And another great thing about these is the opportunity to bring out volunteers and community members to help install these. So in this picture, this is at Goldbug Living Shoreline here in Charleston. And you'll see a number of volunteers there from Boeing. Boeing has actually been a great supporter of our living shoreline builds over the years. But this reef, the shoreline had really eroded away. The marsh was back in this U shape behind the reef. And just in like 3 years, this is the same reef covered in huge oysters with these large clumps of marsh grass growing back behind the reef. So give this a couple more years and that area is going to be completely filled up with marsh. And you talk to the folks out here that go fishing, and they will tell you how this is the spot to fish now, because this habitat has created, right, that great spot for those fish to come. Here's another example. This is our Botany Island living shoreline, and you'll see the dramatic erosion of this marsh back here, just the sharp edge with clumps of marsh grass falling off. Again, great volunteer opportunity. Got a bunch of people out there to help us build this reef. And, this was like maybe a year later, you can see huge amounts of sediment that have built up behind this reef, and it's slowing this erosion here. And I bet you in another year or two, we're going to see marsh growing back up to the backside of these reefs. So it's just so exciting to see these projects go in the ground and really see the results in a short amount of time. And like Joshua mentioned, so in the past, we've said it's essentially easier for a private property owner to get a seawall than a living shoreline on their property, but that is changing. Just in another month or two, the living shoreline regulatory definition will be rolled out, and that means that there'll be a more streamlined permitting process to get a living shoreline on your property. So you have more options, and you have this kind of more natural option to consider if you're dealing with erosion on your property. So that's a really exciting thing that's going on in the state. There's a ton of interest in living shorelines. And then the other thing that's really exciting, so if you'll notice, these are all kind of, we call these residential scale, small scale living shorelines, right? These are the size for a property owner that's seeing some erosion on their shoreline. But we are really interested at TNC in scaling up this living shoreline and showing that it works at a much larger scale as well. So this has actually been done a lot in the Gulf of Mexico. This is an example in Alabama of a living shoreline. And you'll see here, this was all the project here, built in and filled, marsh grass growing. And so this is providing huge benefits, protection to this marina in here. So this is the type of thing that we are looking to scale up here in South Carolina. And with a generous donation from the Susan and Darnell Boyd Foundation, we are moving forward with this project. So we are moving forward with building about an acre size is our goal, living shoreline and in Georgetown. So this map here is downtown Georgetown. And if you're familiar with East Bay and Morgan Park, they're at the end of downtown Georgetown. This is roughly where the project's going to be sited. So this is going to be one of those, TNC really, you know, we're a science-based organization. We put in these, you know, kind of pilot projects that show that these things work. And then we hope that others will take them and run with them in the future. And so just had to throw in a picture of our executive director, Dale, doing a site visit and checking out the project site. But look for this in the next 3 years. We'll hopefully have this in the ground. And, you know, so Joshua, I talked about the residential size living shoreline. And so for any folks listening in, of course, if anybody does have some shoreline property, that's something they may be able to consider. But for everybody else, we also wanted to talk about some natural solutions closer to home, of course, because we've talked about some big projects. So let's talk a little bit more about some residential scale stuff that you all listening in can do today too, because you know it makes a difference from the regional scale to the local scale. Every drop of water counts. But we want to jump into our last poll here. And so this is what % of pollutants can rain gardens remove from stormwater? If you're not familiar with rain gardens, they're a shallow depression in the ground that's filled with native plants and can help capture and filter stormwater. All right, we got a lot of smart cookies on the webinar today. Y'all are getting most of these right. So yes, it's 85%. So our rain garden is going to be really effective as stormwater management system. So Joshua, I'm going to let you walk through some of the things we put in here on residential solutions.
Yeah, sure. Well, at a residential scale, you know, the idea is the same as these other larger scale projects we've talked about. The idea is to sort of, let's understand what nature is doing on its own, what it's trying to do if we were doing nothing, and then let's sort of get out of its way and let it sort of use its own natural intelligence to restore the landscape. And in this case, again, today we've been talking about water, all sorts of different aquatic ecosystems. And you know, if you have a lawn, if you're fortunate to live in a home with a big yard in South Carolina, you know, if you're not mowing the lawn, it's trying to turn itself back into a forest. So one of the most simple things that any homeowner can do is to just let a part of the yard become a forest. It sounds very simple, but you know, a mature tree can use hundreds of gallons of water, pull it from the ground that reduces flooding downstream. But it's not just the large trees. This idea of a backyard forest is, as this little image kind of depicts, also putting smaller understory trees and a shrub layer and then a ground layer. Like you see here, there's ferns and decorative shrubs and flowering shrubs. See many species that are native to our area. So just having an area of 10 by 10 or 20 by 20, a part of your yard, maybe an area that's low lying that likes to hold water anyway, just sort of working with it to let it become a forest again can really do a lot to hold water and you know, kind of cleanse the water before it makes its way downstream. Then of course there's a rain garden, like you mentioned in our poll suggested, which could be more decorative. Usually rain gardens have more shrubs and grasses and flowering plants. Oftentimes homeowners or in commercial buildings will direct a gutter downspout into a rain garden. And there's some very easy design guidelines that are available, you know, for putting these in your front yard even to make them sort of a addition to your yard landscape, kind of a horticultural element that ends up using a lot of water. And again, an area that maybe is already low lying or that's already receiving water, it's a great place to put these. There's all sorts of other examples. of, you know, slightly larger scale. Here's a project on James Island that we built a number of years ago with a larger rain garden system. If you live in a home that has a ditch or a swale along the street in front of your house, there's opportunities there to plant native wetland vegetation in the ditch or the swale to sort of turn it into a bioswale, to let it filter out sediment and pollutants and hold that water a little bit longer, like this example on James Island. Here's an example where a group of homeowners, you know, if you have a shared buffer or a shared swale, getting together with your neighbors and just putting in some plant material, and again, letting something that naturally is conveying water. You don't want to obstruct the flow, but just putting some plants in to let those plants use the water and clean the water can really have a high impact, especially if there's many of these things done in one area. There's also examples of doing things like this on the commercial scale. Here's a commercial office park on Johns Island, where you see the same principle, just on a slightly larger scale. In this case, the parking lot has been diverted into this depressed area, and you see some native shrub palmetto there and cypress trees and other things where the water is able to go into this and into this low-lying area and naturally pool and then gradually soak into the ground, so that it is a whole lot less water that's flowing downstream during and following a rain event. And these plants are using any runoff from pesticides or things that come off of the pavement from, you know, automobiles. They naturally know how to filter that and filter that out. And then also, you know, rain barrels are becoming much more popular across South Carolina. And maybe it seems like a drop in the bucket, but you think about the impact. If every home had 2 or 3 rain barrels of 50 or 100 gallons, that really starts to add up, because not only do you hold that water so that it doesn't go into the storm sewers or go into the creeks, but it also provides a way, especially if there's kids around, or it's a great educational opportunity to use that water after the storm event is passed. When you don't have any water left, you know, around, you have it in the barrel to be able to use to water those plants. This can be a small scale. Here you see like old barrels, or it could also be a commercial scale where you have these, you know, several 100-gallon tanks, again, in this commercial office park on Johns Island, where these tanks are used for toilet flushing. We have plumbing codes that will enable this if you have a large home or have a commercial, you know, commercial building, where you can use water from the rooftop, put it in a tank, do a minimal level of filtration, and use it and reuse it again to keep it from going downstream.
That's awesome. I love those examples. Thank you. And there's so many resources out there too to tap into any of these ideas, and we'll try to share some of them afterwards. We wanted to leave you on this slide. You know, there's a lot of different ways to work with nature, and we've tried to give you a little taste of that today. And oftentimes, so when I talk about nature-based solutions, you know, these are some of my definitions. I talk about a lot of different things, from really large-scale floodplain preservation or big projects like spreading sediment over marsh grass to help it grow up higher, to the smaller scale things, which captures the low-impact development like those rain gardens and those rain barrels and everything in between. And as Joshua said a couple of times, right? So this is really about giving nature a jump start, getting it going, allowing it to heal itself, and then do what it's meant to do. But, you know, one of the reasons we're, of course, the nature side of thing, but the people side of thing that we're also really passionate about this type of work is that these solutions can also really give communities a jump start. So gray infrastructure, hard infrastructure projects, they're often very expensive to put into the ground. They often take a very long time to get put into the ground for various reasons. And then they're also very expensive to maintain. So there's, you know, many communities out there that don't have the resources to tap into those hard solutions and get that hard infrastructure in the ground. Or they essentially are right now standing in line waiting for post-disaster funding, these millions of dollars coming to kind of get doled out to communities. So, you know, so these types of natural solutions, while they may not always solve all of the flooding issues in an area, they are an excellent opportunity to get in there, get in a community faster, get a project in the ground that's going to help, these projects are often cheaper to put in the ground. They're also then cheaper to maintain, because again, you're just kind of giving nature that kickstart and then you let nature do its thing, right? But it's also a great opportunity to then get the community involved and get some community buy-in into these flooding and stormwater issues. So if you are installing rain gardens and you bring community groups out to help dig and plant those native plants, if you have a day where you decorate rain barrels with a school group and then you show them how to hook them up to buildings, right? Those are all community events that allow for really buy-in and pride in the community. And so, for example, the Nature Conservancy, we've been working with the town of Andrews, which is up in Georgetown County. It's a town of about 3,000 people, and they've been hit hard by flooding over the last number of years. And so they did get an opportunity to get some large federal disaster funding money to do some kind of hard infrastructure solutions, because they have some major issues, and so they need that. But they had trouble providing the match for that funding. So the Nature Conservancy, with a grant through Boeing, helped provide some of that match so that they could get some of those big infrastructure solutions in the ground. But then we're also working with them to get funding to install some rain gardens and rain barrels, again, to get that community engagement and buy-in. So overall, I mean, I don't know about you, Joshua, I think this is true for you too. We've seen this growing interest in natural solutions. I think with all of the flooding in the past 5 or 6 years, there's been this move to really, okay, what was working isn't working anymore. And so there's been a growing interest in this type of work. Have you seen that too?
Yeah, I sure have, especially, the last 5-7 years or so in South Carolina, we've really been hit hard by some major storm events and floods, and areas that we never thought would flood. We now see flooding, and infrastructure that we thought was going to last for a very long time. We wonder now, is it really going to last as long as we thought? Kind of in closing, one of the ideas is about natural infrastructure and nature-based solutions is that when we sort of jumpstart these natural processes, we find that these natural systems become stronger with time. They become even more resilient, and they're made even stronger by disturbances. So if there's a hurricane or a big event, it can sometimes reshuffle things around, and the ecosystem is able to grow and become more resilient. Whereas with a lot of gray infrastructure, it is the strongest it will ever be on the day that it's built, and then it begins to decline in value and decline in its different benefits over time. Whereas with natural infrastructure, it's the exact opposite. We sort of get out of the way, we let nature do its thing, we help it along in the process, and then we just expect it to become more resilient with time. That's really the exciting thing, especially living along the coast, for example, where we're seeing a lot of new threats, and we want to let things get stronger with time and help it along its way.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Thank you. Well, we are to our time for questions. And so we got a lot, it looks, so I'm going to jump in and we will answer as many as we can right now, and then see where we get. So this one, Josh, I'm going back to try to catch the first ones that came in. I think this is about the stream daylighting in Columbia. Are the big 8-foot pipes closed by some type of flap system during the storm runoff events, or the small runoff events? If not, how does the water not flow through them all the time?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was actually one of the hardest questions for us to answer. It took us a couple of years to figure out how to do this. There's actually a very large hydraulic structure made of concrete that diverts the water during dry weather. During sunny days, it diverts the water into the new creek. And then during large flow events, there's a weir, or like a small dam that's in the creek. And so when the water gets to a certain height, water flows over this weir or flows over this small dam and goes back into the pipes. So during a very large event, there will be water, the creek will be full and the pipes will be full. So what that does is it keeps that huge rush of floodwaters from causing erosion in the creeks, because there's just so much more runoff in Columbia now than there was 100 years ago before everything was built out. And so there's really nowhere for the creek. The creek can't hold, the natural creek can't hold that much water. So we put that in the pipes using this big structure. Great question.
Can you, related to that, can you give us a sense of how much that creek project cost, just to give an idea of, how much that cost?
It was built over the course of several years. And I know that one of the main budgets for the daylighted portion was roughly $1 million. And then the upstream portion, the existing area that was open, was about half of that, maybe about $750,000, including the big structure. And the great thing is the city of Columbia is in the process of taking this over and making it into a city park. So they'll be doing ongoing maintenance and management of the landscape. The money was really, instead of putting the money into things that we don't provide a co-benefits, a lot of the money was into grading and then into thousands and thousands of plants that will again become larger and more resilient and more beautiful with time.
Yeah, I'd love to compare the long-term maintenance costs of something like that versus something like maintaining a stream underground and the pipes and tunnels that might collapse over time.
We'll do this presentation again in 20 years and be able to compare everything.
Okay, excellent. I'll put that on my calendar. Moving on to Conway, there's a question asking do you know if the buyout area historically actually was a Carolina bay? Lots of bays were ditched and drained in order to develop them.
That's a great question. The best evidence we have suggests that it was not a Carolina bay. The area is actually along the Crabtree Swamp, which is in the last several decades, been converted into the Crabtree Canal, managed by the Army Corps of Engineers. So it looks like it's always been a historic bottomland, but it doesn't appear to have been a Carolina bay itself. It's a great question.
I love how y'all captured that though. That's so neat. Someone's asking, where would parking be to get to this Chestnut Park? Was there parking built into that design?
Yeah, there were several different parking options considered, and that will be part of the fully executed master plan. Again, it'll be a city park, managed by the city of Conway, and it will be open for, all to visit. So that'll be a really exciting aspect of the project.
It will. I know, can't wait for that. Okay, so here's a question about living shorelines. Can private landowners pursue living shorelines to protect their property from erosion, or is this tool only available for public lands? Do you want to take that or do you want me to answer it?
You go first.
Okay. No, living shorelines are a tool that private landowners can utilize as well. And so this regulation that's coming out in a month or two, that will allow, so if you have property on the coast right now, you can go and you can apply for a permit to get a seawall to protect from erosion. But now if you own land, you can go and apply for a permit to get a living shoreline on your property. So yeah, absolutely. This is something for landowners. And the Nature Conservancy right now is actually, we are developing what we call the Living Shoreline Explorer tool. And so this is going to allow private landowners to go in, and it's really a first stop shop to look at it maps the whole coast, and it shows the how feasible a living shoreline is for different parts of the coastline. So you can go in, you can zoom into your land, and you can see if a living shoreline looks suitable for where you live. Like I said, first stop shop, and then you can move forward if it is, and work with DHEC to get the permits and install that living shoreline.
And one of the exciting things is that in many cases, living shorelines can be built either by hand or using very small equipment, as opposed to building huge bulkheads and huge rock walls. Oftentimes are very expensive because they require a barge or they require heavy equipment that's got the strength to pick up big rocks and drive piles or drive, walls or build walls. Whereas a lot of living shoreline methods allow us to, as you saw in the images, to build things almost like at a landscape scale so that it becomes more stable over time. That's really exciting because it can help to lower the cost. And so hopefully they'll be more widespread in the years to come. That's
right. Yeah. And this is a good next question. So this reef is made of cinder block and old shell. So if you noticed in some of those pictures of the living shorelines, they do look like cinder blocks. They're called oyster castles, and they are essentially, well, they're kind of cinder blocks, but mixed with oyster shell. And so they're a great substrate for then oysters to grow on, because oysters do like to grow on other oyster shell. So you see this, it's a great workout if you come out as a volunteer to pass those oyster castles down a line and set them up, but they are kind of like Legos. They lock together too, which provides that stability. But there's a lot of different options, and DNR and TNC and others have studied over time what types of materials work well where. Those oyster castles are great. They'll of course also just bagged oyster shell. There's a variety of options out there to build living shorelines. Okay, we're moving down. Will the Georgetown project, so the large scale living shoreline I mentioned, project protect the waterfront area that floods frequently? I do know that the city of Georgetown is working to get, I believe they're actually going to move forward with a wall in front of like the area that floods regularly, because that's one of those places where you sometimes you have to choose between what you want to save and protect, right? So that's the busy downtown area that does have serious flooding issues. And so I believe they're putting a wall in that downtown area. The living shoreline that we're putting around the park right now will enhance the habitat in that area and stabilize the shoreline, but won't necessarily affect the downtown area. Okay, sorry, I'm scrolling through here. I love all the comments. I'm glad to see great conversation as we're going, and I'm looking for questions. Okay, yes, there is a native plant sale if you're in the Charleston area this Saturday at Charlestown Landing at 9 a.m. So if you want to hop in there. Okay. Sorry, y'all, so many great comments. I'm looking for questions. What is a road retrofit? So that is one of the examples I put in that the array of different types of natural solutions. And when I say that, a number of things would talk about, they're just like culverts that are too small, that are undersized. And so things like upsizing culverts that flow under roads to allow for a more natural flow of water. And Joshua, do you have any other examples of that or anything you've worked on?
Sure, yeah, and much like the example that Eric pointed out here, road retrofits, one of the most common ways to retrofit a road is simply to let the stormwater that runs off of the road surface, allow that water to run into a planted area instead of directly into a storm sewer. Many people don't realize that our storm sewers, most of our storm sewers go directly to a creek, unless you live in a newer neighborhood where there's a stormwater pond. A lot of our storm sewers and public roads go straight to the nearest creek or waterway. So a road retrofit could just take that water from the road, let it go into a vegetated roadside swale, or like the example that Eric gave, like a median in between two lanes. Instead of having it be mounded up, it actually becomes a shallow swale with beautiful vegetation. Water can nourish that vegetation, and then the vegetation will in turn filter the water, use some of it, and then clean it before it goes into the storm drain and then out to the nearest creek. So roads are actually a great opportunity. There's lots of ideas and ways to turn roads into something that's beneficial instead of just a detriment to water quality and flooding.
Absolutely. That's another idea I've had in Andrews. There seems to be a lot of medians and extra asphalt that doesn't necessarily need to be there. So would love to get some of those ideas up there as well. Okay, someone asked about what would be the first step for an HOA to determine if a living shoreline is a good solution for that community. So our living shoreline app that I talked about, once that's up, which will be midsummer, that will be a great first step to determine if it's a good spot for a living shoreline. And then there'll be links to access more information from that point. So I think that's all the questions I see. We're coming up on our hour. I have really loved this conversation, Joshua. I really want to thank you for your time and your expertise today. And of course, many projects we'll continue working together on in the future. Also, definitely want to thank Emerald, Clark, and Greenville Water for being our sponsor for this webinar today. And thank you to everyone listening for tuning in, and also for the great conversation that you've had in the chat. I want to go back and read through all of that as well. If you have any additional questions on anything that we talked about today, feel free to reach out to either Joshua or I. I've put our contact information on this slide right here. And then you can also visit our TNC's website, nature.org/SC. Before you jump off, there will be an exit poll if you don't mind answering that before you jump. But otherwise, do that poll and then have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everybody.